Hi, this is Pastor Barry with the supplement video for Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 37, a discussion I've entitled The Invitation of the King. Before we get to that, a little bit of sort of context for where you are in the calendar and in the book of Mark. We are now at the halfway point in the book of Mark, which turns out to be an important place in the way that Mark tells his story. He actually puts at the very center of his book the great question and then confession. Question ends up being, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. And so, in Mark 1:1, you have that beginning statement, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And then all building up to the first half of the book, you're sort of walking with the disciples as they figure out who Jesus is. Jesus is showing them, and he's telling them, but in parables. And here at this high point of the book, Jesus asks the question, and then Peter gives the answer, you are the Christ. And then surprisingly, Jesus says, don't say anything yet. And the whole second half of the book ends up being a long explanation of what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah, which is not exactly what they thought. Jesus is the king, but he's a different kind of king than they ever expected. Some other things in terms of context here. This is the third of 4 weeks of studies that we're having, which is the longest stretch of Bible discussions that we have before we have another missional activity. So just to give you a bit of a sense of where your group might be, you don't want to wear your group down on doing the same thing over and over again. And so if you have a chance, it's good to change it up during the week for this study. Have people bring food for some kind of dinner together, or move locations to a different kind of place so that you can be in a different space and your group can kind of have a different feel. The other thing that I think is worth doing at this point, because of where you are in Mark, is during people's individual time, if your group has sort of an individual reading or study time, is to have people go back to the beginning of Mark and to kind of follow through different themes all the way through chapter 8. Now that would be kind of a big deal to try to track all of the possible themes in Mark, but what you can do is you can assign different people in your group to follow different ideas. I had just a few of them here. Some of them I borrowed from another study, but different kinds of things that you could look for in Mark 1 through 8. You could look at surprises. What was surprising that came up in this narrative? Conflicts. What conflicts do we see? And again, when people are following these things, they're also following where those things are. You could follow the teachings of Jesus. What has he said so far? You could follow parables and parable-like actions or statements. Remember that a parable is a story in which Jesus sort of hides the truth that it might later be revealed when people come to him. But there are other statements that act as parables that make that same kind of invitation to people so that they will come to him. I think a great example of this is in that chapter where Jesus is feeding the 5,000, and he tells the disciples, you give them something to eat. And I have to think that this is a pregnant sort of invitation for them to ask, how? Like, how are we supposed to do that? That pretty much seems impossible. So you could follow parables and parable-like statements and situations. There's faith versus fear. It'd be a great thing to follow the subject of faith, and especially as it relates to fear throughout Mark. And then finally, of course, you can have someone follow the kingdom. What do we learn so far about the kingdom of God? And we see the kingdom anywhere that Jesus is exercising his kingly authority. And so we've seen his kingship over all kinds of things, over people and over vocation, over sin, over sickness, over demon. I mean, all those kinds of things, right? So you get the idea. All right. We're going to go ahead and focus down now on Mark chapter 8 and talk a bit about what's here. Again, I won't follow the study closely. In this case, there's really not a study to follow. This is one of those studies where your group is generating the questions. On the discussion guide, I've gone ahead and included several questions, and there will probably be several more that come out in this video. But I think it's important to allow your group to learn to ask good questions. So it's not just any old question that they have. These are questions that arise from the text, especially from observations in the text. So, the kinds of things that I asked here were things like, what can we infer about what people believe about Jesus from who they think he might be? So you're supposed to be able to look at who they said he was, and from that, what can we figure out about what people think about him? Similarly, what is clear to Peter? What does he know about Jesus that's true? And how is his vision still blurry? That's kind of an oblique reference back to that two-stage healing of the man. I don't know if you read these context sections in the discussion guide, but in this case, and I think in most cases, it's really important. There's this strange two-stage healing that happens shortly before this section. And you wonder, why is there a two-stage healing? Why is it that when Jesus prays for a man, he's not instantly completely made well? And I think that God is trying to say something to us in the way that this man is healed. I think that Mark is saying something to us by putting that story in such close proximity to the confession of Peter here, because I think it's the disciples at this point who also have had an unclear vision of who Jesus is. There's things that they kind of see and things that they kind of don't, and it's sort of coming into focus for them. It's what at least one part of it crystallizes for them here. You are the Christ. Now, what are some of the other questions that might come up other than the ones that I listed here? You could ask people, as you go through that section, if anyone wishes to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. What does that remind you of in Mark? This might go, with that idea of kind of reading from the beginning of Mark, but I hope what it reminds you of is the calling of the fishermen and the fact that they left everything behind. They left their nets behind. They left, James and John left their father behind. They left their families and their community behind to follow Jesus. And then you could even kind of sneak into application at that point and to ask people, what were your nets? What did you leave behind to follow Jesus? I think that could be a really interesting discussion for people to have as they hear each other talk about what they've left behind to follow Jesus. And if people haven't left anything behind, I think they have to ask, are they really hearing the invitation of Jesus? That section is super important. I would spend a lot of time on that. Those who wish to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. Take a lot of time on that to break that down. What does it mean to try to save your life? I think people are doing this all the time. They try to save their lives by saving money or making money. They're not giving it away, right? They try to save their lives by getting a certain degree because they think that if they can become an attorney or a doctor or a very successful businessman, that somehow they will have saved their lives. Their life will be a great life. Some people try to save their lives by getting married. Some people try to save their lives by getting a divorce. I mean, people are doing all kinds of things to try to to save their lives. And sometimes we think of salvation in such spiritualized terms, but I think Jesus is thinking of all of life. And everybody is trying to save their lives in some way. And he says if you try to do that on your own strength, that you will lose your life. Who's losing their life? Well, ultimately, in a physical sense, everyone is. And so, the question is not whether or not you'll lose your life, but how you lose your life. Will you lose your life trying to save it on your own terms? Or will you lose your life for Jesus' sake and for the sake of the gospel, and then have your life given back to you as a gift from God? This is a faith thing, right? This is what faith means. It means trusting that Jesus' promise is really true, that we are willing to lose our lives for his sake and for the sake of the gospel. That's what it means to have faith, not just to think certain things about Jesus or to have a certain opinion about God or what Jesus did on the cross. He goes on to say, what does it profit a person to gain the whole world but forfeit their soul or their life? It's a rhetorical question, right? There is nothing in the world that is worth losing your life for, right? What could you give in exchange for your life? There is nothing that is equivalent to your life. And then to go on to talk some about what it means to be tempted, to be ashamed of Jesus and of his words. I think many of us can't even relate to that. Like we think, I would never be ashamed of Jesus or his words. But then, if you think about how hard it is for you to stand up for Jesus, to use his name specifically, to share the good news with a friend, to find out what other people believe, you suddenly kind of start to wonder if there's not a bit of shame wrapped up in that. And to talk some about how Peter, in this case, who rebukes Jesus, how his words can be considered like being ashamed of Jesus. What is it that he's possibly ashamed of? Jesus talking about how he's going to die, he's going to be rejected and all these things. Peter, on one hand, may just be trying to be a good friend, trying to encourage Jesus. Don't talk like that, Jesus. We love you, and we're not going to let that happen. But you have to wonder if Peter, as a follower of Jesus, is concerned. He doesn't want that kind of king. Doesn't want to follow that kind of person who loses their life, who is rejected, and who suffers. Because to follow such a person means that we also are embracing those consequences. And the trust, of course, is that God will give us our lives. By way of application, I have a couple of things here, and I'll list a couple more in the video. One is this question of who do people think that Jesus is and why? This is an especially good question if you've got people in your group that are in more than one sort of spiritual location. Not everybody's a believer, and it's worth finding out kind of where people are at in their journey without shame, without prejudicing people. Secondly, you could have your group brainstorm a list of the ways that people try to save their lives. I think this is instructive because people are doing this all the time. We see it all around us. Thirdly, I think you could ask how people might be tempted to be ashamed of Jesus and of his words. And anyway, that's probably enough. Just to remind you, we spent the first half of Mark figuring out who Jesus is. And who is he? He's the Messiah. He is the King. And that's why the kingdom is present. But in the second half of Mark, we spend a lot of time sort of unpacking what kind of king is Jesus? What kind of Messiah is he? And what does it mean for us to follow such a one? So God bless you as you continue to study through Mark. I hope you're getting a clear picture of what it means to belong to Jesus and to be in the service of his kingdom.